was the first time I'd like raised money on my own for like my own thing.
Yep.
And I felt like a complete failure.
Totally.
And so there's pros and cons. One was, okay, I'm this weird generalist. Like, what is my skill? I'm not an engineer. I'm not a designer. I'm not really a BD person. I've done all these weird things. And at the time I was like, I actually don't have any skills. I had no confidence. The investment bank I worked at, the hedge fund exploded, the business failed.
Yeah.
And so I just felt it was ultimate low. Really, like I'm not good enough theme coming back. But the interesting thing after the failure was the 2 years leading up to it were terrible. It's always like, what am I going to do for a salary? Oh, I'm not going to have any money. I'm not going to be able to afford my lifestyle. And what am I going to do? And how am I going to get a new job? And then as soon as the company failed, like boom, there was a new job. There was a new opportunity. And failure is not actually durable. So you fail once, you fail again, you fail a third time, like you keep going. And if you work hard and are aggressive, there's always a company you can join, a school you can like teach at or learn from, a company you can start.
Welcome to the Maximus podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Cam Sapa. As a clinical psychologist, medical school professor, and CEO, I specialize in helping men be better in mind, body, and masculinity. On this podcast, I interview extraordinary men as a clinician would, hearing their come-up stories of how they became the men that they are today, and having them share their secrets of actionable advice on how to look, feel, and perform your best. All right, welcome everyone to the Maximus podcast. I'm very excited today to have entrepreneur and investor Robbie Bent. He is currently the CEO and co-founder of Inward. It is an at-home app that teaches you how to do breath work, and that's paired along with a physical space, sauna and ice bath, and a social hangout space as well that provides community to create kind of a comprehensive experience for their clients. He also studied at Ivey Business School at Western University and has helped create other businesses such as INVI Energy, Romely, and has worked on Ethereum as well. It's fair to say he has a broad focus across health and technology that kind of reinvents the way that we interact with each other in our environment in order to improve our health and build better communities. Also on the side, Robbie is a philanthropist who volunteers his time with the Big Brother Foundation as a mentor, volunteers with Habitat for Humanity and the Covenant House of Toronto, which serves to save homeless youth in Canada. Definitely one of the more interesting people that I have the pleasure of being associated with. And so I look forward to chatting with you today, Robbie.
Awesome. Super excited. Love what you guys do at Maximus. I follow you. I've been following you for a long time. So really honored that you invited me to come and chat.
It's our honor indeed. So as I mentioned, we love to start out with our first segment called Making the Man in order to really like dig in and understand our guests and provide positive role models, masculine role models for a lot of our community. So I'd love to start from the beginning. So just tell me a little bit about where did you grow up and what your upbringing was like.
I grew up in Guelph, 100,000 person city outside of Toronto in Canada. I would say standard sort of suburban city life. Family was privileged, which was quite lucky. So never really had issues financially or concerns there. And family was very, let's say, interested in success and in my success. I was the firstborn. My mom loved me a ton, really wanted me to achieve. And so I remember even going back to grade 2, putting up my hand in class, trying to show I had the right answer. For that feedback, that validation. And so from a really young age, this idea that like success, achievement was important for validation was sort of part of my upbringing. So happy to dive into that a little more. But yeah, I think standard city life. I'm 36 now, so this would have been 20 plus, years ago.
Totally. Yeah. And, it's so interesting how our early kind of family and childhood experiences, shape us. So it sounds like, coming from a successful family, you're expected to follow in their footsteps and, continue the family line. What was that experience like for you? Was there like pressure did you feel in order to kind of live up to expectations and going through school, et cetera?
Yeah, I think so. And it sort of warped my entire, career path, values. It was a huge driver that even to this day, after I would say 8 years of a lot of self work,
Hmm.
is one of like the clear things I'm trying to work on. And so for people out there that are like very type A, disciplined, competitive, it's that need to win, that validation that is always present. And so it was, hey, I'm not good enough.
Mm,
That is the common thread is I'm not good enough. I'm my own worst critic. And you've probably heard this, you never talk to someone else the way you talk to yourself. And
mm,
so it
hmm,
was, I want to go to the best business school. Why? Well, my dad was in business. I
hmm.
didn't even really think about what it is I actually want to build, what I want to create at that age. I thought, I want to have money. I
Sure.
want girls to like me. I want to be cool. Like that's the kind of stuff that was driving my entire high school, was like play sports, do well in school, go to good college, make money,
Hmm.
have nice things. And so because external validation was so important to me and I was so self-critical, I felt good getting attention from others,
Right.
friends, women. I wanted success and credibility. So like extreme ambition for this external validation, and that drove my work ethic in
Hmm.
school. It drove me wanting to go to business school and choosing the program. And I never really looked into other things. I just saw what my dad did and thought, hey, this is the best business school in Canada. This
Hmm.
is where I want to go. I'm going to compete hard and I'm going to go there.
Right.
And then for 4 years at school, it was, okay, well, what do the smartest kids at this school do? Well, they go into investment banking.
Right.
I didn't even know what that was. I got to school and I heard iBanking. I thought it was internet banking.
Right. Right.
I find out, oh, it's investment banking, and never even thought to ask, well, what does this career entail?
Mm,
And you hear these stories about 120-hour weeks and very poor culture, and they're true.
yeah.
And never thought like, oh, am I going to enjoy this? Is this helping serve anyone? It was
Right.
just, okay, this is what the smart kids do, and I want to prove I'm smart and I want to make
Hmm.
money. And so that was the arc of my career path through, all the way from elementary school to university.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of a curious thing because obviously, you kind of look back on it with obviously the blessing of hindsight and wisdom that the feeling of sort of incompleteness, right, or kind of not ever feeling good enough, as you put it. Obviously, that's not a great driver for people. But on the other hand, it did push you to study hard, compete in a competitive society, obviously get a good education, certainly open up economic opportunities. So it sounded like it did some good and bad. How do you sort of reconcile these things? And maybe like with one day, if you think about having your own kind of kids, like what do you want to like take the lesson from your childhood and want to impart, maybe going forward?
That's really tough question because I think I'd correct the other way. And
Hmm.
so even in the way I'm acting now, it's trying to, I'm thinking in my mind not to have so much discipline,
Hmm.
really encourage my child to figure out what they want to do because they love it. And so I think what I gave up, so one, I would never regret those choices or feelings
Yeah.
because they're very important for growth, and we'll get into it. But I had a venture backed company that failed completely.
Mm,
I was fully broke, and as I mentioned, this was all I cared about, was succeeding. And so
right.
that's what actually broke me and sent me down this path of health and wellness, which ended up changing my life. So I would never say like, oh, I wish I was raised differently. I'm
Right.
very, very
Right.
content. Now what I had given up is feelings of balance and
Hmm.
passion and self-love and play. And so in a life that's driven by achievement and the I
Hmm.
and task lists, it becomes very difficult. Like I didn't even know I was a creative person until the last few years.
Hmm.
And I would have said, yeah, I'm a operations person. I'm extremely meticulous, detail oriented. I'm like, I get up and I crush
Right.
tasks. And it turns out that's actually not my skill set at all. It's
Mm,
just something I learned recently, was like creating these healthy experiences. That's my passion, just selling to people,
right.
creating a vision, like facilitating breathwork sessions in a sauna and watching people smile. Like the the opening of the heart and the feeling of satisfaction that comes through that is significantly more than achievement. And so
Right.
while the drive was important and built a ton of great skills, I think that's what um, self growth can sometimes take away from.
Totally. By the way, I love your story because I think we have a lot of people, certainly in the tech and entrepreneurship community, who are part of our community, listen to this podcast, And, when they hear like play and joy and passion and breath work and so, it can come off as a little hippie. But I think the interesting thing about you is you actually have the credibility, right? In terms of coming from, our world, right? Like you were in tech, you had a venture back company, went to business school, you were very much on the sort of traditional sort of road to success. And I think, you've sort of evolved and found this sort of path, which I actually think is a very important lesson for the people that are listening to us. So why don't we actually get into that? I'd love to hear where was sort of the inflection point? Like maybe talk a little bit about your experiences studying business, and then maybe going on to when you graduated, like what path did you choose after business school, and how did that shape you?
Sure. And so I alluded to it, and this is just like such an amazing story. So I'm super excited to tell,
Hmm.
especially if these are your listeners, because there's just a lot of meat and learnings here.
Totally.
And so I chose investment banking, again driven by money,
Yeah.
and some of my idols were investment managers, Warren Buffett, Seth Klarman, John Paulson.
Hmm.
While I was working at this hedge fund, I was investing in distressed debt, doing crazy hours. Like I got a stapler thrown at me once,
Oh, yeah.
multiple all-nighters, common stuff you hear in banking and in the finance world.
Right.
And I was obsessed with like investing. I read every book I could about it. And in 2008, the credit crisis happened.
Hmm.
And I came in one day and we had I forget the amount, but like a massive fund, let's say $1 billion.
Hmm.
And we were investing in publicly traded distressed bonds and loans.
Hmm.
And so when the credit crisis hit, all those things, the company was half hedge fund, half private equity vehicle. None of the private equity vehicle companies could be sold in that environment. So I came in one day and they had sold the entire fund. And in what was the best environment for distressed investing ever, I was wiped out and out of a job just in one day like
Wow.
that. And so I was living in LA and like, man, this is awful. And not
Yeah.
only that, I was kind of looking around at people and out of shape, pretty miserable, no hobbies, not a lot about like family values. And again, this is a small microcosm, so
Sure.
I'm not going to generalize, but I kind of looked around and said, like, I'm not motivated to be this person
Hmm.
in 20 years.
Yeah.
However, at that point, making money was still the driver. And
Yeah.
so I kind of started thinking like, well, where can I do that? And to me, software engineering and tech was pretty foreign. This
Hmm.
was 2010. So like Y Combinator is just getting started.
Hmm.
There aren't really this concept of like unicorns. And so I did something that looking back is super dumb, like really had very low chance of success.
Hmm.
But I partnered with technical co-founder in Toronto and we built a global telecom platform.
Hmm.
And the idea was to create a SIM card that could virtually change identities, very similar to how Google Fi
Hmm.
works now. And so we were able to have this like sort of magic prototype that used somebody else's SIM card system. And when travelers would go away, and we focused on really wealthy
Hmm.
investors, they would be in UK making a call back to the US and it would say, they get a text message saying, hey, you just saved $500. And
Hmm.
that was the order of magnitude for roaming. If you remember back in
Yeah.
that time, it was like $5 for 1 meg of data
Right.
on these phones. And we thought, wow, this is amazing. And so we were able to do that to raise money from some super wealthy individuals who thought, wow, this is, I can use my phone, my
Hmm.
most important thing when I'm traveling and do business. This is going to be huge.
Right.
And so my driver still was, I didn't care about roaming. I just thought like, hey, this is a great there's a market opportunity here. This is great. I'm going to be a CEO, and again, the ego was kind of driving that decision.
Mm.
And I'll stop there and see if there's anything you want to double click on, but I can also just talk about what the results of that were.
Yeah, I think it's a great story. And I love that you mentioned that this is the path that smart people do, because I certainly think when you go, whether if you come from that background or you don't come from that background, I certainly like I had no idea what investment banking and consulting was until I went to Harvard, and then that was like par for the course. Literally 50% of the graduates went into those fields, and if you did well and you're at the top of your class, I graduated with highest honors. So like that's what smart people do. They literally recruit from the top 5%. So whether or not you wanted to do it, if you're kind of like an ambitious person and everyone around you is like, well, that's what the best people do, you almost feel like, oh, okay, that's the logical next step. But I had a lot of classmates who had this mentality. Maybe they knew that the culture was not that great, and obviously it has a negative impact on your health. But they're like, I'm going to do it for 2 years. I'll take the sacrifice. It'll set me up, as a stepping stone to the next best thing. But what I kind of found is you can't like pretend like you go through like war for 2 years and you come out like totally normal on the other side of things. So I'm kind of curious what your experience was, sort of leaving that world, and what was the long term residual impact on you.
Yeah, so it's a death trap. So you do your first 2 years in banking, and then you generally the thing next is like, oh, the smartest banking analysts go to the buy side, and
Hmm.
so that means I'm going into private equity or a hedge fund where instead of supporting investors, I'm now making the investments. And like, whoa, that's the thing. We're going to be looking at companies, we're going to be choosing them, investing in them, and that's going to be exciting. And
Hmm.
now my workload's going from 100 hours a week to 75.
Right. Huge
And so then
improvement.
you get in that path, and your pay goes up, your prestige goes up, you're now an associate at a buy side firm, and you're giving a speech at your business school, and it's super powerful lock in.
Hmm.
And then if you make it through those 2 years, like I was lucky, like who knows if I would have left. My 1 year into the hedge fund stint, the hedge fund exploded.
Hmm.
And in 2008 in LA, 2009, there was no hedge funds hiring. And so I just thought, hey, I'm gonna do something
Right.
else. And doing that something else was, there was so much discomfort. I knew nothing about hardware engineering. I thought I knew
Hmm.
something about raising money
Right.
because I worked in finance. I didn't know anything about that, about hiring. I made every mistake you could make, and
Mm.
that's why the company ended up failing. But sitting there being the dumbest person in the room is just very challenging. There's a lot of discomfort, and that's why it's difficult when, as a super smart person in
Hmm.
finance, you're getting paid 4 years in, potentially more than $500,000.
Mm.
It's like, okay, if I want to switch my career now, that's a really hard
Yeah.
decision to make. And so they call it like golden handcuffs. And then as you get more and more senior, your pay comes, in equity, performance, bonuses, and those things pay out over a year. So then you now have to walk away from salary plus massive compensation. And so it's very tough to leave those roles once you're kind of entrenched in them.
Yeah. I found that to be the same, even with my peers who, um, weren't necessarily super financially driven, but they're like, it almost seems stupid to walk away from huge sums of money. Particularly, it's like your parents took 10 years, 20 years to make that much money, and you can make it in a year, and it almost seems like like delusional to turn that down. But you realize like, well, what's the opportunity cost, right? Of that lifestyle and the opportunity cost of other things that you could be doing. Um, on that note, I'm really curious because I feel like people still do consulting and banking, but it's no longer like probably the number one hottest career coming out of like college or business school. I would actually argue like tech entrepreneurship and being a founder is. And funnily, I tweeted about this the other day. I said, the best and worst thing about Silicon Valley is it allows people to be founders who never could have been, right? Because they wouldn't have been promoted into the role as CEO. Maybe they don't look the part, so to speak. On the other hand, I also think there's a lot of people who become founders who have no business becoming founders and being leaders, but it's become easy, or maybe it's become cool to kind of do that. So I'd love for you to talk about that, because you talked about sort of the ego and the I in terms of like being a CEO, and like what should people watch out for in making a decision to like become a founder?
Whew. So yeah, there's so much here. And again, if you find something interesting, feel free. We can go to that specific point. And I'll just start with my first journey
Hmm.
for those who are listening, and like, how do I get started? And like, you're ready to walk into discomfort and imposter syndrome
Mm.
because you literally don't know what you're doing. And so for me, like some of the mistakes I made, okay, well, we're building this global telecom solution. I didn't know anything about lean startup. I had no mentors. I was building hardware in Toronto.
Hmm.
um, okay, we want to build the software on the SIM card. We want to build the SIM card overlay itself so it can fit on other SIMs and slip into a phone so you never actually have to take it out.
Hmm.
We want to build the backend billing platform. We want to build the carrier interconnect platform. And not only that, it's going to work in iPhone. I'm not even sure if Android was around when we first started, but it's going to work in like Nokia
Hmm.
devices and all these phones. And oh, it's going to be for North American travelers going to Asia and Africa and the UK, and it's got to work and be perfect. And the founder now, for me, it's like, man, we should have just built the software on the sim. Everything else we could have rented or licensed.
Right.
We should have made it just for the iPhone and for travelers in Toronto going to the UK and watch
Mm.
what happened. So that was the first mistake, was just not knowing what I was doing, and then not being aggressive enough to ask for help. So if you don't feel comfortable reaching out and asking for help. Even now, I'll ask for help 15 times a day.
Mm.
Like, hey, can I be on your podcast?
Mhm.
Can you try my product? Can
Sure.
you share this? And like, it's just rejection city.
Mhm.
And so if you're not comfortable with that, or that scares you, like that's what makes a leader, is like nobody cares about your business. So
Mhm.
you have to tell the story. You have to ask, and you have to keep asking until you generate a certain amount of hype. So I think as a founder, you look back, and if that scares you, it's also like, maybe I'm gonna grow,
Mhm.
right? And I'm gonna learn. And so the interesting thing, how that business ended, we built this crazy solution, had about 100 people working for us.
Mhm.
Early on, I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. If we had somebody more
Mhm.
senior helping me, we're gonna grow faster. We're gonna be
Right.
able. We're gonna make this work. And so we went and hired somebody, very senior executive from one of the leading telcos in Canada. And I thought,
Mhm.
okay, this is it. This guy's going to close all these deals with all these carriers. We're going to get our SIM card in all their stores. And the first thing that happened is we went from 7 employees to 30. And
Mm.
all of a sudden, I don't really know what's happening anymore. I don't know who's doing what, like, to grow that fast without the proper systems,
Mhm.
and like almost pre-revenue, pre-product market fit,
Yes.
I would say. And it became very difficult. And so we were just raising money all the time to like build this thing and not understand who was doing what. So like completely mismanaged,
Mhm.
because we hired someone who had 7,000 people
Wow.
working for them,
Yeah.
because I didn't have the confidence in myself that I can do it.
Yep.
So like, if you're listening, the best thing you can do is talk to people who are one step ahead of you,
Mhm.
and now there's time. You could go to Y Combinator, you could go to On Deck, you could just follow on Twitter. Like, none of that stuff existed. And I
Mhm.
personally just thought, like, oh, I can just do this myself. So one of the lessons I learned from that is, when I want to learn something, who are the best 3 people in the world?
Mhm.
Can I get them on the phone for 1 hour to like dive deep? And in any new skill you want to learn, talking to the best 3 people, or people who know what they're doing,
Mm.
even though it takes time. And we do this for every single thing we do, whether it's like a physical space build out, an app build out, raising funding. We just call it a sprint, like a research sprint. We interview 3 amazing people, and it's not the time it takes, it's how much time does it save from making serious mistakes.
Mm.
And so going back to our business, we'd spent about 25 million bucks over 4 years. Last 2 years were extremely contentious,
Mm.
dealing with investors that wanted more warrants, that were challenging, delays in the development because of what we were building.
Mhm.
Finally, when it's ready, we had spent so much, and roaming prices had declined by 90%. And so strategically, we were using something that, for carriers, the providers, is kind of a loss leader. They can cut roaming prices anytime, it's all profit for them.
Mhm.
So if they wanted to keep a corporate deal, they could just throw in the roaming. And then from a consumer standpoint, the product experience, it wasn't seamless enough.
Mm.
And so that was another thing. We got into Best Buy. Oh man, gonna be amazing. We're in Best Buy. Like,
Right.
we've made it. And 1 out of 10 people couldn't install the SIM, or had a problem, and would come and say, hey, this is an issue. And so, the retailer doesn't want to carry that
Yeah.
and deal with that. And so it turned out it was too hard to use
Mhm.
for the retail customer who travels infrequently. And then it wasn't cost competitive with corporates. And so we built this amazing thing, but then distribution was super tough.
Mhm.
So I learned about that. And so where we end up, we spent too much money. I had to fire the entire team over a 2-year period, which was
Oof.
like super awful.
Yeah.
So thinking about being a founder, it's like, okay, I'm letting people down, people
Mhm.
that like worked hard with me. That's also the people skills of being a founder are kind of the most important, most challenging part.
Yeah.
But something really, really interesting happened. So, I got personally sued. We lost all the money.
Oof.
I, at one point, had to take equipment out of a data center because they were going to shut us down. So this is
Mhm.
before AWS.
Okay.
So you get a note like, hey, pay 100,000, we're going to shut you down. So, well, you know what? We're going to make a server change, like
Uh-huh.
getting our equipment to move to the next data center.
Yeah.
And so I go down with the ship. Business fails. One of my friends had invested $1 million.
Yeah.
So like, imagine what it's like to see this guy now out in public,
Right. Right.
how that feels. My parents had invested money. It was the first time I'd like raised money on my own for like my own thing.
Yep.
And I felt like a complete failure.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so there's pros and cons. One was, okay, I'm this weird generalist. Like, what is my skill? I'm not an engineer. I'm not a designer. I'm not really a BD person.
Yeah.
I've done all these weird things. And at the time I was like, I actually don't have any skills. I had no confidence. The investment bank I worked at,
Mhm.
the hedge fund exploded, the business failed.
Yeah.
And so I just felt it was ultimate low. Really, like, I'm not good enough theme coming back. But the interesting thing after the failure was the 2 years leading up to it were terrible. It's
Mhm.
always like, what am I going to do for a salary? Oh, I'm not going to have any money. I'm not going to be able to afford my lifestyle. And what am I going to do? And how am I going to get a new job? And then as soon as the company failed,
Yeah.
like, boom, there was a new job. There was a new opportunity.
Hmm.
And failure is not actually durable.
Mm.
So you fail once, you fail again, you fail a third time, like you keep going. And if you work hard and are aggressive, there's always a company you can join, a school you can like teach at or learn from, a company you can start. So really take away, even if you shouldn't be a founder, which I shouldn't have been,
Mhm.
that was the worst case scenario. I completely screwed up, made a ton of
Yeah.
mistakes, burned through a bunch of money, failed, and learned doing that, and which I realize now is like I actually have all these skills. I can
Mhm.
hire, I can build teams, I can raise money, I can sell. Like I had a toe in all these different things. So moral of the story for founders is like just massive emotional roller coaster and
Mhm.
challenge. But no matter whether you succeed or fail, I think it's an enormous opportunity for growth.
Absolutely. There's so many great lessons there in what you just shared. I mean, the three that I take away is, people always talk about you have to be willing to take risk, but I think you bring up a very important corollary that people don't talk enough about, which is you have to be willing to take rejection, right? And over again. So that I think, you either have to have thick skin or be able to develop it pretty quickly. Second, I love what you said about, you're going to have imposter syndrome. You don't know what you're doing, especially if it's the first time around, maybe even the second time around. This is my third company. I'm not even sure I completely know what I'm doing, but I love that you level up by calling the three best people in the world in that particular area of expertise, whether it's building an app, investing, etc., to level up really quickly. That's a great, I think, very practical tip, that people can take away. And then third, I love your point about sort of failure not being, durable. I see people, not just you, but like a lot of people bounce back from incredible, failures and go on and do very well. Like people have very short-term memory too. The founders of Clubhouse, which is valued at $4 billion, which we were just talking about before the show, people forget they did like I don't know how many half dozen failed social apps before then, and then now they found hit like iron this time around. But that's the nice thing about I think the world is like people don't really care long term about your failures. They're just going to remember you for your one success and of course how you treated them.
Yeah, and if you're a younger founder, you're 20 to 30, like now's the time to do it. And I've seen some of your tweets about measuring your life based on money and success or children.
Mhm.
And so something I'm thinking about now, I have a beautiful, amazing fiance who actually saved my life.
Mm,
And we're gonna have kids this year. And
awesome.
and now the risk profile changes significantly. And so it's something I would say, even if okay, I'm ready to take the risk. Like, what risk are you taking at
Mhm.
24 or 26? Okay, fine. You might go broke. So what? Like, if you don't have a mortgage, you don't have debt, which was super lucky for me,
Yeah,
or you don't have a family to support. Like, that's again, like we talked about these golden handcuffs for investment bankers. It's the same thing. The longer you wait, the more responsibility increases.
totally. So tell us about the next step. So this company obviously dissolved. You're probably not feeling great out of the personal and professional sort of outcome of that. So how did you sort of manage kind of going through maybe a little bit of your grief around that, and finding sort of a new path forward?
Yeah, so this is where it gets like a little bit out there or a little bit like different than
Hmm.
the traditional path. And so at the same time this was happening, I was dating a much younger girl than me, found out she was cheating on me. And so it was my, personal ego around work and then around like, am I attractive? Am I a good person?
Yeah.
Was just like destroyed. And so I also struggled with ADHD.
Hmm.
And so I really am attracted to stimulation.
Yeah.
And so, like, startups, excitement, work, extreme sports, and drugs and alcohol.
Hmm.
And so I actually had, during these last 2 years, a pretty bad drug problem.
Hmm.
And so I was using cocaine on the weekends just to disappear,
Yeah.
basically. And that was combined with these failures is like rock bottom. And
Hmm.
so one of our investors said, hey, why don't you come out to Israel? And you know how to build hardware companies now and build teams.
Hmm.
I've worked with you a bunch. Let's find a company here and fund it. And so in Israel, I decided like, okay, well, I'm going to move out there and get healthy
Hmm.
and like no new friends,
Right. Starting over.
just complete restart, be away from these unhealthy habits. So I went out there and it's pretty intense. I'm not Jewish. I don't speak
Hmm.
Hebrew. Some points I lived in this small city called Ashkelon, just outside of the Gaza border. It was my first time hearing like missile sirens where you would go and hide in like a little room
Yeah.
and just kind of like out there, like, what am I doing with my life? Like I'm in this place alone. Um, However, in that space, I was going to come home for Christmas break
Hmm.
and I just thought like, you know what, this isn't that affordable right now. I'm looking to buy a company. I don't have any money.
Hmm.
I'm going to go do a Vipassana meditation retreat
Okay.
instead. And so that's something I've been interested in meditation since high school, like 10 minutes a day using Headspace, heard it a bunch of
Hmm.
places, but not really feeling super comfortable with the
Yeah.
practice. And so I went, over Christmas break, ending on New Year's in the north of Israel, the small town, Daganya Bet. I don't even know if you can call it a town, but,
Hmm.
did this first 10-day meditation experience. And at that experience, I learned about psychedelic medicines.
Mm.
And so I thought, okay, this is pretty interesting. I might as well try it out.
Yeah.
And so somebody at the retreat invited me, sunrise, forest, like experience at this university campus.
Hmm.
We met at the campus 4 a.m., take LSD, go into the woods.
Hmm.
And I have a pretty beautiful experience, but not
Sure.
not like life changing one time
Hmm.
kind of thing, but definitely very powerful.
Right.
And so after the meditation retreat, I was still drinking
Mm.
occasionally and decided, maybe about a year later, while I was working in Israel, like I want to, this drinking is actually the problem, the drinking, which would then lead to drug use.
Hmm.
And so that's something, what are the options? And so I kind of like looked around. I'd heard about psychedelics because I'd done that
Hmm.
experience. And then I learned about ayahuasca. And so myself and one of my best friends flew to Peru, like kayak deep into the jungle,
Mm.
like stilted huts. And we did 4 ayahuasca ceremonies. And during those ceremonies, a lot of the stuff I mentioned when we started the call, I'm like really comfortable talking about
Mm.
like these old urges and needs
Yeah.
and beliefs. And like at the time, I didn't even know any of these things. They were just subconscious.
Yeah.
Like I did it because it made me feel good. And so I started to realize like, why am I so self-critical? What does it mean to love yourself? Like, why was I even using drugs? And like
Hmm.
one of the first times I smoked a cigarette in grade 8 to be cool
Hmm.
came up, and then like being bullied, like these like emotions came up and were processed.
Amazing.
And after that, I came back to Toronto and I've actually been sober ever since,
Mhm.
which is almost six years now.
Congratulations.
And I found a ton of power with a daily mindfulness
Hmm.
practice, retreats every once in a while, and psychedelic medicine use a few times a year
Hmm.
with like a trained guide.
Sure.
Psychotherapy also. I'll stop there. We can chat about whatever you want, but would say I don't think psychedelics are a silver bullet.
Mm.
So I don't think you can just go and like take these medicines. Like I've found enormous uh, differences versus peers who have used them by working with
Hmm.
trained psychotherapists, having community. And I mentioned my fiance who had saved my life and why. And so I think there's an entire system around these things
Hmm.
that work for behavior change. But I'll stop there and we can kind of go into whatever you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, what an amazing story, and thank you so much for your openness and sharing that. That's why I think you are such an interesting role model because you come from such a straight laced background, but you talk about how these things really transformed your life. It's funny too when you talk about sort of self love, self compassion. I almost feel like people who are uninitiated, if I can be if you're allowed to use that term, it almost makes people cringe, right? Because it sounds so sort of hippie. Maybe it doesn't sound masculine, right? But I actually find that like even some of the strongest, toughest guys I know, when they start to get into their emotional maturity, their psychological development, they start to realize some of the things that you were realizing, right? Like where does all this like where does this drive, like this incessant need or thirst or hunger come from? Yes, maybe some of it is natural to sort of being a man or like functioning in society, but yeah, the chip on the shoulder, I would say, it's often coming from someplace, whether it's early childhood experiences, the need to sort of satisfy the ego, etc. And once you sort of do some of this inner work, if you will, right, whether it's through psychotherapy, psychedelic medicine, or just kind of difficult, painful experiences, I actually do think hitting rock bottom is its own sort of, initiation, if you will. And it sounds like for you, it kind of took all of these things to start to put you in a different path and maybe even perspective in life.
Yeah, I think the question that starts coming up is like, who, and the one that recently is coming up is like, who am I?
Hmm.
Like, who am I actually? And so this might sound weird to the performers out there, but it's, you're digging and it's like, okay, well, if my company was worth 100 million, like, why is that important?
Hmm.
And what of that have I picked up and learned and what is real? And so a lot of stuff I'm trying to work through now is just, because the urges are still there. And so we're building what's like a massive vision. Like I want to build, and we'll pick up the story again,
Sure.
but I want to build a personal transformation engine. But then you ask yourself, well, does it need to be 50 locations?
Yeah.
And, or should it be 5? And it's like a lifestyle. And there's these two competing needs that I can feel. Like there's this part of me that's, as I said, like guiding someone through a cold plunge, watching them smile.
Hmm.
On Christmas for the first time, somebody called me who's been sober
Hmm.
for a year, who's become one of my best friends because of our space. And like those feelings, seeing the awe in people's eyes around these experiences, it lights up your soul.
Hmm.
And okay, fine, not soul, but it lights up, like for engineers listening, it just lights up a part of you that feels inspired.
Yeah.
It's a real feeling. There's energy to it. It's passion. Then on the other side, there's, well, I want to build this to make money and I want to be on the podcast.
Hmm.
And that's still there for me. But this side of like, okay, this stuff inspires me. It feels like that's getting to who, who am I? And it's,
Hmm.
wow, it's somebody that wants to help others. It's kind
Right.
of beyond the need for success. So
Yeah.
yeah, your point rings true to me a lot.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, right? I don't, and I talk about this on Twitter all the time. I don't think there is a you, quite frankly. I think it's a narrative, it's a story or a construction that we create. And sometimes when you have those psychedelic experiences, you have the experience of that, right? You can intellectually understand my point that I just made, but it's different when you kind of like almost like can watch that it is sort of a mask, and it's something that you can take off. But to your point, I do think, if there is a self, it's really your values, right? What are the things that are important to you? Who do I want to be? What purpose do I want to serve in this world? That's the you. And I think getting to the heart of that can help shape some of those decisions, right? Like whether do I have a lifestyle business, or do I, if I'm not in TechCrunch, I'm not a success. And unfortunately, I feel like in our society, like how much money you raise, like how big your company is, what you exit for, that's the glory, because it's obviously makes sense in a VC back world where it's all about like massive outcomes and ROI. But that's not for everyone, quite frankly. And if it is, it may serve a different purpose, right? Where for me, I've had bootstrap lifestyle businesses, and that was important for that, what I was trying to achieve with that. And obviously doing a venture backed business now, but for me, it's for a very different purpose. It's not for massive financial gain. It's to be able to have as broad impact, as possible. I want to dig in a little bit about, one of the, I think, really important points, and I hope people don't gloss over this, which is the issue of addiction. And, I think it's actually a very under addressed and under talked about issue, particularly in tech, because I think people associate addiction just with drinking and drugs, which obviously it's a massive part of it. But I've been sort of beating the drum in the last year that their addiction is really a spectrum. Um, Digital addiction is a huge under addressed issue. Behavioral addictions, right? Whether it's sex or gambling or eating, all of these, or internet or gaming, pornography, all of these things are addictions, and they're underappreciated. Just because you're not physiologically dependent doesn't mean they're not problematic. They don't cause issues in our lives. And it's worth exploring and addressing. I find addictions to be the hardest thing in the world to treat, certainly as a psychologist, and someone who's a psychiatry professor, and training others to do it, because it often is, we understand like the surface level of it, right? It's often to an avoidance of unpleasant sort of thoughts, feelings, memories, emotions, and it numbs, obviously, that. But it really does help addressing sort of the root cause of some of those things, and also what's missing in people's lives, whether it's significant relationships, community, like you were talking about. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that in sort of your road to redemption, if you will, and kind of, overcoming your own addictions and vices. How did you sort of navigate, sort of your healing process, and what can people take away from that, right? Because there is so many different things to approach, and where do people start?
Yeah, so huge question. And this kind of, your points on where your transformation came from, we can get into when I came back and working at Ethereum
Hmm.
and how that transformed into the current business. But on addiction specifically, this is something I'm extremely passionate about just because I like to work through my own problems. And this was the idea around the entire community we're building. It was like, what worked for me? How do we make that scalable for others? And
Hmm.
at first it was like, oh, it's the psychedelic medicines.
Yeah.
And 30 of my friends went and tried, came back within 1 month, back to the old habits.
Mm.
Then it's like, oh, well, maybe meditation helps.
Hmm.
14% of people in the US have a meditation practice. 86% do not. It's a very challenging
Hmm.
technique to pick up.
Yep.
And so while I was at Ethereum, I found success from those two things, as I mentioned. And I was trying to teach like my team
Hmm.
at conferences, friends, writing these crazy blog posts, sharing them, and like literally zero traction.
Wow.
Even people like amazing entrepreneurs, super disciplined, meditate 300 times a year, and then will call me like, hey, I think I'm going to quit. I don't know if I'm seeing the
Yeah.
benefits. And so it's like, okay, well, that on its own is a single player game,
Hmm.
very, very challenging
Yep.
in terms of you're thinking, conversions. It's the conversion is low.
Hmm.
Then it's like, well, what is working for me? And
Hmm.
so I'd been going, the other is environment. And so, okay, like a lot of my friends who failed, they're at a bar,
Hmm.
and at the bar, they're going to pick up girls,
Yes.
and you're around alcohol. You're at a restaurant, you're around alcohol. And it always starts as like, oh, I can have a few drinks, slowly declines. And so it's, what is the replacement for that? And you can't really go to a fitness class at night. You don't want to go to necessarily a doctor's office or AA where you feel
Hmm.
like, I have to admit I'm an addict and there's something wrong. You want to feel in a place where you feel inspired.
Hmm.
And so my fiance introduced me to bathhouses,
Hmm.
like Archimedes in San Francisco.
Hmm.
I lived there for a while, would go every week. And it's a Russian traditional place. There's not really any explanation of the health benefits. It's bright lights,
Yeah.
it's not the same as a hospitality like Soho House, for
Right.
example. And it was amazing every time. No one is on their phone. You're in
Mm.
your body. You're feeling amazing. Any nervousness you have about social anxiety, the cold boosting the norepinephrine in the brain,
Hmm.
making you feel vigilant, attentive, alive. So like you naturally want to chat. And so we just found these experiences to be super powerful, a healthy way to socialize and engage. And then I had a fiance, and so there's a couple things with her, right?
Mm.
Like love and compassion makes you feel loved,
Right.
but it's also somebody to be vulnerable with
Mm.
and to get accountability from. And so if you don't have a partner, I think like these men's groups that are growing,
Mm.
which gives you a chance via physical or digital to just say like, what were your wins this
Yeah.
week? Have someone listen to you and like make you feel seen, and also be able to share and someone to hold you accountable. And so I think the mixture of all of
Yeah.
those is seeming to be super powerful for addiction, at least for me. And it's kind of what I want to share. And it's, the psychedelic medicine, what it does for me, really, like there's mystical experiences. Great.
Mhm.
There's this, you mentioned these experiences of this thought of if that, imagine you didn't have an identity,
Mhm.
you're not a male, you're not this age, you're not like the funny guy, you're not a sports fan,
Mm.
all that stuff fades away. And it's like, who am I? That's what you feel. And when you don't have the identity, you feel connected to others, you actually feel like everyone's the same. So you feel this unbridled love. And so, yeah, you have this mystical, amazing experience, which is beautiful. And I would say you have a 30-day, and it changes
Mhm.
depending on the amount taken, the substance, but you have a 30-day window where there's a lot of neuroplasticity and
Mhm.
you can change habit. And so I think they're very powerful if you're dealing with addiction, to make the local changes.
Mm.
But if you don't make the local changes in your daily practice, and I like to also recommend
Yeah.
mindfulness. It doesn't have to be meditation. It can be breath work. It can be going for a walk. It can be like writing or playing music, whatever it is. It's just time to yourself,
Mhm.
allowing boredom to to be there. And then this like men's group idea. So I think the combination of all those
Hmm.
things is enough to really help with substance problems. And then corollary, which we'll get into, I have all those
Hmm.
practices and found myself during COVID phone addiction.
Yeah,
And
totally.
like the stats on a phone addiction, it's from somebody who knows what being addicted to drugs feels
Yep,
like. It's the same feeling. And
absolutely.
so if you're sitting there watching a movie and you have the urge to check Twitter, that's not
Yeah,
that's not
no,
normal,
it's
like,
crazy.
and I found like, oh well, sorry, I'll stop there, and yeah, we can get into that.
Well, I thank you for sharing that. And I think it's such an important point that I want to reiterate about. I generally find most individual techniques standalone are not silver bullets. You get people who are obviously really big advocates of them because maybe it has changed their life, or maybe that's their kind of thing. But I always tell people, I'm like, look, I literally teach and practice a mindfulness based therapy. I'm a huge fan of mindfulness, obviously. But even then, like I do it as part of ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy. It's literally one of 6 different processes, right? And if I only had one of those 6 tools, I don't think I could actually help very many people. But it's the combination of like literally what's 1/6 of many other things that I do. And for some patients, it helps more. Some patients, quite frankly, it helps less. I find my ADHD kind of entrepreneurs, they have a very hard time sticking with a sitting down, eyes closed meditation practice. We adjust it. I actually am a big fan of walking meditation for those folks because it's just active. They can keep their eyes open. They're much more likely to do it, quite frankly, and it gets the restlessness out just by walking. So just an example of like not being a panacea. And same thing, I'm obviously a big fan of psychedelic medicine. And I'm an advisor to a company called Mind Bloom that does that with ketamine. But I even say that too. I'm like, it's not a panacea. Really, I very much do believe in the concept of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and that you need to integrate these experiences into the real world. And we know this from history, right? Like, the 60s and 70s were supposed to change the world. It didn't. It kind of fueled the cocaine and crack addicted 80s. And I was like, what happened to like the whole counterculture? And I think it was because, people came down from these mystical experiences, and there's still a dish full of dishes to be washed, as was written about in the Tim Leary biography. And like, someone has to do the dishes. Who's going to do the dishes? Is sort of became a refrain for the 1960s, and I still think is sort of true today. But I think your conclusion from that, which is, look, a multimodal intervention is probably going to be best. I very, very much agree with that. And it's going to be probably different for each person, right? Like the 3, 4, 5 things that work for you is going to make sense. Maybe you already feel very connected. You have significant relationships and friends, and maybe the community part's not as important. But I would say for a lot of folks that I know that are a little bit more isolated, lonely, or maybe they don't have the depth of connection that they need, maybe that's all they need for their addiction, right? This is like they just, it's really the social aspect that's missing for them. So I think you got to like personalize it and understand what your underlying needs are, and come up with sort of some combination treatment that is best for you. And the last thing I would say is don't do it alone. I love what you said about men's groups. That's obviously a big thing of what we're doing at Maximus. We have an online group. So if anyone's listening and they're like, you know what, that sounds appealing to me, join us. It's I believe it's discord.maximustribe.com. You can join our Discord, and we have little squads that'll keep you accountable. And yeah, if you want to share your wins and losses for the week, we'll help support you through that too.
Yeah, and then that one, whenever I join, I'm like, not Maximus specifically, men's groups. If you're thinking, oh, that sounds silly, I don't want to share, these are strangers, there's always that discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strange, kind of weird thing to do. And so you come and you're like, I don't want to do it. Always for me, there's like, and then I do it and I feel significantly better. Very similar. Think about it like a mental workout, like going to the gym. Like you need to flex these emotional
Mm-hmm.
muscles. And so even though there's a bit of resistance there, that's completely normal. So don't let that throw you off. I think one other thing to add that's interesting that we found is a lot of people that are struggling don't want to ask for help,
Mm-hmm.
and they also don't even know how they're feeling. So if
Mm-hmm.
I was to ask most people, I would say like, 30 to 40 age range, what emotions did you feel today? I think the answer would be I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that average person going from that to I'm going to see a therapist, be vulnerable, explain my problems is like a massive
Huge.
jump. So how do you make these things fun and cool? And maybe not as deep, but what we found, and the story started with an ice bath in a backyard, but we found is if, what is the equivalent now that people want to be mentally more healthy? where is the space for that? And so what if instead of going to a traditional bar, you could come to the social space that felt cool, amazing music, amazing design, great vibe. You're doing the sauna, you're feeling great, you're doing this ice bath, and then there's a class. And so in the sauna, it's completely dark. Someone's playing a drum, you're sharing your fear, you're letting go. Maybe you're doing an eye gaze and an ice bath to connect. Maybe you're sharing a piece of gratitude. So taking kind of a lot of these things you're saying and weaving them into a class format that's cool. And I don't think many people have tried that yet because a lot of mental health is like, hey, there's something wrong with you, press.
Right.
And for most people, great. If you're willing to admit that, there are tools. But for a lot of my friends, I just found they're not even, they don't even want, like, that's not even on their radar. So it's like, how do you allow people to secretly feel good, which I think is really powerful.
I think that's a huge thing. Yeah, and that's why I think if you position it as like a support group, I'm like, guys, generally, unless they're really looking for support, it's different if you're going through something. But I think that positioning sounds a little too like, oh, I got to talk about my feelings and kumbaya for most guys. Versus the way that I frame it is, look, guys have been in groups since the beginning of time, right? In Jack Donovan's book, The Way of Man, he literally, well, I think one of the titles of the chapters is the way of man is the way of the gang. And what he means by that is not just street gangs, but like literally we kind of were raised in hunter-gatherer societies where you probably were with a band of people, like 10 to 25 people that you use for cooperative hunting to bring down like a woolly mammoth, because you can't do that by yourself. And so we're very much used to, in fact, working and living together in very small, close-knit groups, literally for the last 50,000 years. And even in the most recent times, you did that in school, you did that with sporting clubs or activities, and maybe small workplaces. And we've lost, I think, a lot of that. And I think people are feeling very isolated because it's kind of up to you to kind of make your own maybe group. Maybe you have individual friends, maybe you have a squad or clique if you're lucky. But I think it's literally our sort of evolutionary history to be in these small groups. And not just for when things are bad. It's literally like mutual reliance, both physically and I think emotionally. And so, the guys sitting around a fire, like coming back from a hunt or battle, whatever it is, and talking about what they just went through is I don't consider that group therapy. I think that's literally part of our heritage. And, we're trying to recreate that online in a lot of different ways. So last thing that I'd love to get into is you mentioned sort of your work with Ethereum. Tell me about how you got into crypto, because that's an interesting last bit. And then how did that transition to, obviously what you're doing now? You alluded to it in terms of getting all these people to start, trying some of these practices. But what made you take the leap into trying entrepreneurship again?
Yeah, so there's a great story here and a battle again with ego, how you mentioned lifestyle business versus like this huge thing. And so the person I went and did the ayahuasca with actually was one of the founders of Polychain
Mm-hmm.
Capital, one of the largest crypto funds. And he said, hey, we're funding all these companies. You've got experience building engineering teams and dealing with like really deep technical challenges. Can you help? A lot of these people are just out of school,
Mm-hmm.
professors. Can you like assist? And so I went and met with a bunch of companies from their portfolio and was just really, there was a change in hey, I want to make money to, hey, these people are really smart.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is so interesting. Why are all these people like the smartest people I'd ever encountered? Why are they all interested in this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And at the start of crypto really was what it was like. You were either super passionate about
Mm-hmm.
decentralization, quirky fringe, or like genius computer science researcher. And so it's just so interesting. And so I moved to San Francisco, got caught in the hype,
Mm-hmm.
and joined a company out of their portfolio. And then I had been interacting with the Ethereum Foundation a lot, helping create community. And so this is what I like to do is reach out and interview people, learn, and then turn that into content. It's like my superpower. And so I had done a bunch of cool stuff for Ethereum just kind of because I thought it was cool. So I made a community of security researchers in Telegram that really took off. I made another community of community managers. I made a community of developers. We did interviews where we interviewed all the best developers in the space, asking what they needed from Ethereum, and then published the results. And the foundation was like, why is this guy doing all
Mm-hmm.
this? So I ended up joining the Ethereum Foundation living in San Francisco and Berlin and all these different hubs, traveling around, living in a house together with a bunch of people for like 2 months at a time. My fiance came with me. We both had one backpack for like 2.5 years. And it was amazing. Like the pace of learning. And again, it's like, okay, well, my background isn't in software engineering. It's not even in engineering. I worked in hardware. And so I have to learn like Solidity. I need to understand how Ethereum works.
Right.
This is like one of the most complex technical things out there. Like, can I do it? I'm sitting around with, in year one, a bunch of developers around a table using like the craziest jargon, a Web3 and, different
Mm.
tools and like all these different libraries and Solidity and audits and, consensus. And you're just like, okay, I feel like the dumbest person here. And I sat through it. I read, I worked so hard. I talked to people, I learned, and it was such an amazing experience. Like Ethereum exploded. The ecosystem from when I was involved was around $10,
Right.
and then just, as all of a sudden working on grants and then ecosystem growth and working with developers to improve the system and talking to all these VCs that I had admired and, just people, some of the people I was working with were some of the most inspirational people I'd ever been around. And it
Mm.
went from, hey, I'm not good enough to like, I'm crushing it. We're growing. It's the number one smart contract platform worldwide.
Mhm.
People are hyped. Like it just felt so inspiring to be in this place where now I've won, and for
Right.
the first time I had money. So I was investing in 2017. I was putting like all my salary into
Mhm.
ETH and, lucky enough through this role, met a bunch of early stage
Right.
teams and kind of just wanted to back some of my friends. And for the first time I was financially sound. And so now I'm feeling like confidence, bravery,
Amazing.
like all this work was worth it. And then I also have this like amazing fiance and these practices that I'm doing on the
Mhm.
side every day. And so that, how does that end?
Mhm.
Right. And so everything's going super well. I'm in Toronto
Mhm.
and I build this ice bath in my backyard.
Mhm.
And it was just to solve my own problem of I love cold plunges. My water doesn't go cold enough. And so every night for a summer, I had, one of my partners asked me to move back to Toronto and we would do this together, my fiance and my partner and two facilitators,
Mhm.
and we would run these ice baths, and they would be with, essential oils and sound bowls and all this kind of kooky
Mhm.
stuff. So you go to like, okay, well, I'm an Ivy grad and work at Ethereum. I'm in the back wearing a little Banya hat and like playing a sound bowl
Yeah.
like every night.
Yeah.
Like, why am I doing this? And it was because for the first time, I would see people get in the ice bath and get into a state of meditation or presence.
Mhm.
Like, full stop. Lawyers that are 50 don't care about spirituality.
Yeah.
And like they would stop and be like, holy shit. And so then we'd hang out around a campfire in my backyard. We grew a WhatsApp group to like 200
Mhm.
people. People would just show up at my house. I'd be having coffee in the
Mhm.
morning and they would be out there. I was like, okay, this is cool. And so we're like, what's the next step? It was becoming winter. And
Mhm.
we're like, oh, maybe we can do a little pop-up for our community. And
Mhm.
so, what you see behind me is a garage.
Yeah.
It's 800 square feet. And we put a sauna in it, did all the reno ourselves, put up a little landing page and a ice bath. And then it kind of transitioned from this meditation thing to like a social hangout. And we talked a bit about this before, but I started seeing people become friends, let down their boundaries. Like people would meet in the sauna and go on a ski trip. People would meet in the sauna and start dating.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, we're doing classes. Like, no, this wasn't planning to be a business.
Yeah.
30 people a day are coming and they're loving it. And I'm starting to get more and more satisfaction from this.
Yeah.
Right. But on the flip side, I'm like, very senior role at Ethereum, everything's crushing it. I love crypto. I
Sure.
love the people. And there's like some ego attached to
Sure.
that because of how much it's on Twitter and like raising funds and all these things. And but I'm doing this and I'm like so passionate about it. And so then COVID hits and we had been doing breath work, and so I'm a breath work facilitator and it's a modality I've used for a long time and was attracted to because it really worked for people that struggled to meditate.
Mhm.
And we start doing breath works on Zoom. And on Zoom we have this like crazy experience where like 20 people come, then 40, then 80, then 120, then 200. And it's like the Zoom is bumping.
Mhm.
It's okay, this is cool. And people are asking for recordings. They're saying like, hey, could you do one for sleep? Could you do one for my morning routine? Like, could you put them to YouTube? They're donating money. They're saying like, hey, like, can we get more? And I'm just
Mhm.
like, okay, this is cool. And at that point, I realized there might be something bigger here than a space. It was kind of the culmination of all the things that had worked for
Mm.
me in a way that is like very cool and inspiring. And so like even our breathworks, they're like Burning Man electronic music. It's like super fun. It's not saying, hey, this is spiritual or there's enlightenment. It's using science
Mm-hmm.
backed coherent breathing, box breathing, holotropic style
Mm-hmm.
breathing, as like super ventilation, Wim Hof method, all these different kinds that with this just enormous amount of science
Yep.
around what's happening at a cellular level and giving them to people in a way that's like fun. And
Mm-hmm.
then so we saw that grow, and so we decided to build an app and got to a point where I had to make a decision. Like I'm now
Mm-hmm.
running, okay, there's a digital content app business, kind of like a Headspace, and there's a physical business. Like this is a lot. And so I
Right.
kind of looked at Ethereum, and I had to, it was a very tough decision for me.
Sure.
And if you talk about regrets, I'll look back, and the money side of me is like, oh man, if I had started a venture fund, 2 years ago, like I was there, like
Sure.
the first DeFi conference there was a presentation at DevCon in Prague, and it was like the first time the word DeFi was out there, and I led a panel on it. And my ego mind will say, oh, like you were there, you could have started a podcast, you could have raised a DeFi fund.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really trying to just let that stuff go. That's like the old me, and
Right.
that's where the transformation has come. Is like I want to build something that helps people, that gives me these feelings I mentioned, where someone's calling me on Christmas because they're not addicted anymore,
Totally.
or they've conquered their addiction. So that's for me was like, even though there is some ego in this, also wanting it to be big in many locations and talk about my journey, there's like this heart piece which I never really felt for the crypto product itself. And that's the sign to me that like, okay, you're doing the right thing. Like you can feel the joy that comes from, also it was going to sound kooky, but I spent the weekend a couple weeks ago developing a couples breath
Mm-hmm.
work where there's like picking the music, facilitating
Mm-hmm.
it. There's like an eye gaze involved and like thinking about what to say and like record. And it was so much joy. And so to me, it's okay, well, like that's a sign that you want to be doing more creative stuff,
Right.
right? So
Yeah, amazing story. I think the good thing about crypto though is, you can still invest in it even if you decide not to have it be your full time thing. I actually met Olaf Carlson Wee in San Francisco years ago, and I'm an LP in Polychain, and so I'm sure there was some FOMO. I was like, should I have gotten into crypto? But I was like, I just invested in it, and you get to reap the rewards that way, and that's fine. And I can work on the more mission driven stuff just like you. But by the way, one of the things that I really like about the physical space aspect of what you're doing is, there are these like the Battery in San Francisco or Soho houses in major cities around the world. But to me, they're almost just exclusive fancy spaces. It's not really different than a bar, club, or a lounge. It's just for elitist people who want to impress guests, and so they take them there. Not to knock any of those places, I enjoy them very much, but it's not a different experience, really, right? It's just a more exclusive, nicer version of anything you can get elsewhere. But it's very different to be in a social space that is activity oriented, right? Like you're sitting in a sauna, or you're sitting in an ice bath, or you're doing breath work, which is a very different experience than holding alcohol and chatting, right? Like in a cocktail lounge kind of thing. So I really actually, and I talk about this with guys bond over activities, especially, and doing things together, like almost creates that kind of experience of closeness because you did something together. So that I think is a very unique thing about what you're doing, and I think it enhances the socialization.
yeah, the one cool piece on that, which is different, it's kind of the secret, is that like you mentioned, like this is a social
Mhm.
experience. And so you go to a lot of these spaces and they're bars, exclusive social clubs, but then there are also health spaces. So like an infrared sauna, a float, those are single player, you go on your own for
Right.
health. And so the key is like, can you use these things to drive social? So like, why wouldn't you want to hang out? Like we have a insane fire pit
Hmm.
built into our new space inside with like a crazy cover. So everyone in between sits around a fire because humans since the beginning of
Yep.
time have gathered around a fire to share stories.
Hmm.
And so everything, the lighting, it's red lighting because red makes you feel more comfortable. You look better. You feel more willing to share. You feel more cozy. So it's geared in a healthy way to have you connect and share. And then not only that, that's like the social piece, great. But then there's like performances. So you're in the sauna and someone's taking you through these like mental health exercises, which we're not going to call them that,
Hmm.
but you mentioned it's like a fear release and like, what are you afraid of? Six people share in the dark. And you're kind of like normal person. You go into this place, it's really cool. Music's cool. You're not expecting to have like an emotional experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can deliver those at scale on demand, get people into their heart and body, that's insane,
Right.
and it's accessible. So like, okay, it's $30 a session. Like, that's great. You can go and feel better at any time. So yeah, not that, just like thinking about that is like my life mission now.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it easy to not think about the, the money and other stuff before.
Absolutely. And it's so beautiful, I think, when people start to find their mission and their purpose. I almost had a very similar experience. I mean, I was working for a venture capital fund, driving down from San Francisco to Menlo Park every day. And I remember I was like, okay, I got to listen to VC podcasts. I would listen to whatever 20-minute VC every once in a while. And I think I did that like literally a few times before I was like, boy, this is really boring. And I kept on listening instead to like this YouTube channel of the Minnesota Men's Conference, whereas these great speakers like Robert Bly and Michael Mead and these great storytellers and Robert Moore, who wrote King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And I would just listen to them because it'd be like a long 45-minute, hour, sometimes hour drive in traffic. And it was so much more compelling. And it was kind of funny because the whole time that I was working there, I was like, I'm going to be an investor. I'm going to go down this venture route after, starting these companies. I don't want to start another company at this point because of all the crazy challenges that you mentioned. And funnily, after, the year I spent there, I obviously ended up starting this company. And in hindsight, it was almost like stupidly obvious, right? Like I almost want to hit myself in the head and be like, why did you just start this sooner? Like, obviously that's what you cared about. Like, and it was unconscious though. I was just like, there was a part of me that was telling me what my sort of, if you want, soul, spirit, whatever, was compelled to do. Was like I'm not listening to these investor podcasts. That's not what I'm compelled by. It's really, like this whole idea of like, can I almost like pass the torch on from the mythopoetic men's movement, which kind of unfortunately died out, and carry that in the sort of social media generation, right? And it's very parallel to sort of your story about finding your way around health and wellness practices.